welcome back. We were going to be finishing up A Christmas Carol. Finally, I was hoping to have this done last week, but things being as they are made it a little difficult. So here we go, picking up from the sentence that we left off on. The final sentence from part one was Ward would have justified in indicting it for a nuisance. So it continues, "Oh, captive bound in double iron," cried the phantom. This is Scrooge speaking with Jacob Marley. "Now to know the agents of incessant labor in immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it's susceptible is all developed. Now to know that all Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that a space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet, such was I. Oh, such was I." This is Jacob Marley, lamenting over his mistakes that he has made in life. "But you were always a good man of business," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" the ghost cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. That dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chin at arm's length as if it were the cause of unveiling grief, and flung it open again upon the ground. So what this is describing is reason why Jacob Marley's mouth, or he had that rag tied around his head, was because they couldn't get his jaw to close, so they just tied a rag around his head. But when Marley undid the rag, when he untied it, his jaw dropped. It was kind of made funnier in the Disney version, and there is one other version of the Christmas Carol where Scrooge takes his rag off. George C. Scott version that came out in '84. His mouth falls open. Well, during this whole time, Marley is having to articulate his jaw with his hand to get himself to speak. "At this time of the rolling year," the specter said, "I suffer most. Why, I did not walk through the crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned downward, and never raised them to that blessed star, which led the wise man to a poor abode. Were there no poor homes in which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob. Pray. Don't be flowery. Don't be light upon me. Jacob, pray." So, "how is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many a day, and it was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. This is no light part on my penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that ye have yet a chance of hope to escape my fate, a chance of hope of my pronouncing Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank ye. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by three spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell as low as the ghosts had gone. Is there a chance of hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visit, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path which I have tread. Except first, expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls one. Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second the next night at the same hour, and the third the next night at the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. So this took a period of 3 nights. It wasn't all done in one night, as they had indicated in the movie. They did that to save time, of course. Look to see no more. Look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us. When it has said these words, the specter took its wrapper from the table and bound his head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound his teeth made. Then his jaws were tight together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, and that his chin wound over him, or over and about his arm. The apparition walked backwards from before him. At every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so when the specter reached out, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach. When he did, they were within 2 paces of each other. Marley's ghost held up his hand, warning him not to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raise of his hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings, inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The specter, after listening for a moment, joined the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge flowed to the window. Despite his curiosity, he looked out. And the air was filled with phantoms wandering hither and thither in a restless haste, moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty Some few, pardon me, I'm dyslexic. They might be guilty governments he linked together. None were free. Many were personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being able to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon the doorstep. The misery with all of them was clearly that they were sought to interfere for good. It in human matters, but had lost their power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it were when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands. The bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. He began from emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or he being from the emotion he had undergone, or from the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation for the ghost of lightness of the hour, much in need of response, went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep that instant. Stave 2, or Chapter 2, the first of three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of the bed he could scarcely distinguish a transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to piercing the darkness with his ferret eyes, and when the chimes of the neighboring church struck the 4 quarters, meaning the full hour, he listened for the hour. Then this grim, astonishing heavy bell went from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten to the works. 12! He touched the spring of his repeater to correct a most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat between 12 and stopped. Why, it's impossible, said Scrooge. That high I have slept through a whole day and far into another night. I don't know what it is. I've slept up to 17 hours before, so who knows? Is it possible that anything has happened to the sun that it was 12 noon? The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost from off the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything. And he could see little then. And then he came, all he could make out was that it was very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro, making a great stir, and there was unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief. 3 days after the after sight of this first of exchange paid to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge for his order and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again and thought and thought and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again like a strong spring released in his first position, and represented the time problem to be worked as all through that it was it a dream or not. Scrooge lay in the state until the chime had gone 3/4 more. Then he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a vision when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considered that he was more and more to resolve the time, but he considered that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven. And this was perhaps the wisest resolution to his power. The quarter was long, and there was more than once he was more than once convinced that he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong. That ding dong. I'm a ding dong for saying that. 1/4 past, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong, 1/2 past, said Scrooge. Ding dong, 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong, the hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. He spake before the hour bell sounded, and now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. The light flashed upon in the room upon the instant. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. No, the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, those of which his face were addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, staring into a half recumbent attitude, turned himself face to face with a half recumbent attitude. He was half on his side, or he was on his side. And he turned to his other side, meaning, then he faced with an unearthly visitor who drew them as close to it. I am, oh geez, this is bad. As close to it I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. Okay, I hope you guys understood that. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet so not so like a child, like an old woman viewing through a supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, of being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was as white as if with age, and yet its face not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on its skin. The arms were very long and muscular. The hands are the same, and yet there were of common strength. Its legs and feet were delicately formed, were like those upper members bear. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, of the sheen in which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and its singular contradicting of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers, but the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, that all by which all this was visible. There was doubtless occasion of its using, and the duller moments of a great extinguisher for a cap which it held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked, it was increasingly steadiness, that not its greatest quality, for its belt sparkled and glittered, now in one part and now in another, and that what was the light one instant, at another time it was dark. So the figure itself fluctuated in its distance, being now a thing in one arm and now in one leg, and with 20 legs, now a pair of 2 legs without a head, and a head without a body, which dissolved into parts, no outline which would be visible, in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. When the wonder of this, it could be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold of me? Asked Scrooge. I am. The voice was soft and gentle, singularly now, in its instant of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. Who at who and what are you? Scrooge demanded. I am the ghost of Christmas past. Long past? Inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarvish stature. No, your past. Perhaps Scrooge could have not told anybody why, or if anything could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. What? Exclaimed the ghost. You soon put out the worldly hands the light I give? So it is not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, forced me through who trains of years to wear it low upon my brow. Scrooge recently disclaimed all intention to offend all the knowledge of having willfully bonneted. I don't know what that word means. BOONETED, or BONNETED. Bonneted. Interesting word. First, at any period of his life, then made whole to inquire what business had brought him there. Your welfare, said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obligated. He could not help thinking what a night of unbroken rest would be more conducive to the end. Spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, your reclamation then, take heed. It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to the pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm, and the thermometer on a long way below freezing. He was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. At the grasp, thought a though a gentlewoman's hand was not to be resisted, he rose, and finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasping his robe, he supplicated, "I am immortal," Scrooge uh, remonstrated, "and liable to fall. Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and he beheld it was more than this. The words were spoken, and passed through the wall, and stood upon an, an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished, not a vestige of which had been seen. The darkness in the midst had vanished before it, for it was a clear, cold, wintry day, with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven," said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly, and a gentle touch through it had been a light and instantaneous. It appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. It was conscious of a thousand odors floating in the air, each one connected with a thousand thoughts, hopes, and joys, and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered. This is an unusual, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfolded." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting downwards, with boys upon their backs, and called out other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. And the boys were in great spirits, and shouted with each other. The broad fields were so full of merry music and crisp air that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are the shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of you." The rejunct rejunct the jocund travelers came upon as they came. Scrooge knew the name of every one, and he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them. Why did his cold eye glisten, and his heart leap upon as they went past? Why, he was filled with gladness, and when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at the crossroads and byways for their several homes. What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas, what had it ever done to him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends. is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane and soon approached on a mansion of dull red brick, and with a little weathercock surmounted a cupola on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house with but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used, and the walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken and the gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive in this ancient state within, for entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold and vast, and there was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door to the back of the house, and it opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At the most of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon the form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from mice behind the paneling, not a drip from a half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, but the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence that gave a freer passage to his ears. The spirit touched his one arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window with an axe in his belt and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come he did come for the first time, just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson, as they go. And what was his name, who put down in his drawers, asleep at the gate of Damascus? You don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom, turned upside down by the genie, where he was upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business he had to be married to the princess." He's referring to storybook characters that he had become acquainted with. Those were his friends at that time, after all of his schoolmates had left. To hear Scrooge extend all the earthiness of his nature on the subject, his most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see the heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city, indeed. There's the parrot, cried Scrooge. Green body and yellow tail. What a thing, like lettuce growing out of the top of his head. There he is, poor Robinson Crusoe, he called him, and he came home after sailing around the island. Poor Robinson Crusoe would have been Robin Crusoe. The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. Hollow, hollow, hoop, hollow, halloo! When he rapidly of transition very foreign to the visual character, he said in pity for his former self, poor boy, cried again. I wish, Screw muttering, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him, after drying his eyes with his cuff. But was it too late? What is the matter? Asked the spirit. Nothing, said Scrooge. Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something, that's all. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying it to do so. Let us see another Christmas. Scrooge's former self, larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty, and the panels shrunk, the windows crackled, fragments of plaster fell upon the ceiling, and naked laths were shown instead of how it was brought about. Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct. Everything had happened so, and he was alone again, and the other boys had gone home for the holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost with a mournful shaking of his head, glancing anxious towards the door, and it opened. A little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, putting her arms about his neck and often kissing him, addressed him by dear, dear brother. I have come to bring you home, dear brother, said the child, clapping her tiny hands down to laugh. To bring you home, home, home. Home, little Fan, returned the boy. Yes, said the child, brimful with glee. Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is much kinder than he used to be. Home is like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more that if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here. But first, we are to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in the world. You are quite a woman, little Fan, exclaimed the boy. He clapped his hands and laughed and tried to touch his head. For being too little, he laughed again and stood to tiptoe to embrace him. She stood to tiptoe to embrace him, and she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, bring down Master Scrooge's box there. In the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, and glared at Master Scrooge with a ferocious condensation, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind, shaking his hands with him. They conveyed him and his sister into the various old well of shivering. Best power even was seen. Were the maps upon the wall and the terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy and old. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered the installments to the dainty of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the past boy, who who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but it was but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, but he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk began being by this time tied to the top of the chaise. The children bade the schoolmaster goodbye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily towards a garden sweep in quick wheels, dashing the hoar frost of snow from off the ground, off the dark leaves of the evergreens like a spray. And always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, the ghost said. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Although they had the moment left of school behind them, there were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, their shadowy passengers passed and repassed, and their shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way of all their strife, tumult, and real city there. For it had made plain enough by the dressing of the shops, and here it too was Christmas time, and it was everything, and the streets were lightened up, and the ghost stopped in a certain warehouse and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. I was an apprentice here. And they went in, and the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he would have knocked his head against the ceiling. And Scrooge cried at great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig. Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig, alive again. I always wanted to meet Fezziwig. He seemed to be a really cool dude. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked at the clock and pointed to the hour of 7 and rubbed his hands, adjusting his capacious waistcoat. For those of you who don't know, a waistcoat is what we in America refer to as a vest. I am wearing a waistcoat, meaning it's just a coat that goes to your waist. That's it. And laughed all over himself from his shoes to the organ of benevolence, and called out in a favorable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo there, Ebenezer! Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice, Dick Wilkins to be sure. And Scrooge to the ghost, bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear. Yo ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig, with a sharp clap of his hands before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with all the shutters up, one, two, three, all had them in their places. 4, 5, 6 barred them and pinned them. 7, 8, 9 came back before they could even have got to 12, panting like racehorses. Helio ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from a high desk with a wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads. Let's have lots of room here. Helio, Dick. Cheer up, Ebenezer. Clear away. There is nothing they could have cleared away or could have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, and it was dismissed from public eye life. The public from it was dismissed from public life forever. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed.